He watched as the three attendants moved over to the switches attached to the wall. Switches that would release the trap door. This was so that neither of the three would know who would actually release him to his death. One of the other officers moved over to him and put a black death cap over his head. He felt him move away, and immediately his footing fell away. He felt himself fall, and there was now only blackness, for he was no longer in this world. Welcome to another episode of This Happened Here. We visited the West Virginia Penitentiary. In this video, I will take you on our tour around the penitentiary and will share with you stories about some of the convicts that have lived there, the crimes they committed, and their attempts to escape. I think you'll like this one. If you do, show me by clicking the like button, please. These stories that I'm about to share with you are going to be graphic because that is what I do, and these things actually happened. The stories are about inmates at the penitentiary after all. So viewer discretion is advised. Now, if true stories of the weird, disturbing, sad, or sometimes awesome, as told from the mouths of the people who have experienced it, is something that will interest you, then consider subscribing to this channel. We travel around the US and to other countries in search of these stories, and you will be sitting or walking right by my side as we go in search of these stories. This video will run a little longer than what you are used to on this channel, but I promise you will not be mad about that, because so much happened here at the West Virginia Penitentiary, aka Moundsville Penitentiary. And even though I can't fit all of these interesting stories in this episode, I will try to find those that have more facts to back them up. Because between 1920 and 1995, 998 inmates died in that prison, and 450 of those deaths happened in a section called North Hall, aka Blood Alley. A likely name because of all of the murders and suicide that took place on this block. We will be visiting that cell block in this video later. Immediately after this episode, I will be taking you to the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, which also has a ton of interesting stories, so stay tuned for that. If you are a regular viewer and listener of my stories, you will know more often than not that I try to tell my stories from the point of view of either the onlooker or go into the minds of those people whom the story is about. Today, this story will be told partly like my video of Brushy Mountain. If you want to watch that video, you can click that link in the top right corner now. And I'll also try to tell these stories through the eyes of my made-up characters, just to give you a better picture of what happened there. Yes, all these characters were created by me, but the stories are all true, unbelievable as they may seem. I am your host, LT Bartek. Here is a little history before we move on to these stories. The West Virginia Penitentiary was opened in 1866, right after the Civil War, which ended on April 9, 1865, and it closed its doors in 1995 due to the inhumane treatment of the inmates, especially how they were housed. All were crammed inside a tiny cell with 2 beds per 3 inmates. The penitentiary was in operation for 129 years. This picture shows all of those that were executed at the prison, and the 9 at the bottom row over to the right were electrocuted in the electric chair, Old Sparky, this chair here. Also, these are some of the weapons that were confiscated from the inmates. This room was where the visitors came to see the inmates. Some would roll liquid LSD inside a dollar bill and squeeze it through these grates just so they could take it, sell it, or use it to kill. For instance, the murder of William H. Snyder, aka Red, one of the most vicious inmates to ever walk the halls of West Virginia State Pen. I will tell that story later in this episode. Now on to these stories. Harry Powers. At 9 a.m. on this early spring morning of Friday, March 18th, 1932, it was cold as Harry walked up the unlucky 13 steps to the gallows at the Moundsville State Penitentiary. He was not afraid of death. He had caused death, and now, too, he was facing it. Harry's hands and feet were bandaged securely, but even as he stumbled a few times on the steps walking up to the gallows, he refused the officer's help. He didn't need it. Warden A.C. Scroggins and the guards pulled back the curtain, showing the onlookers where he stood beyond the stage-like trapdoor in the white death room chamber. He looked over at the 42 people who had come to see him die and forced himself to hold in the smirk that threatened to show upon his lips. He stood a little taller, showing them how immaculately he was dressed in his dark pinstripe suit and bright light blue tie, a close match to his eyes. He had done his best to make it a perfect knot just for them. He had had them starch his white broadcloth shirt so that there was not a wrinkle in it. He hated those who had caught him, and he hated the press because they had villainized him in the papers, and they were all here now, looking. But he was not going to lose his nerve, not in front of them, not today. He did not when the judge pronounced him guilty and sentenced him to death, and he would not show them now. They would not break him. They say your life flashes before your eyes just before you die, and now he saw the faces of the 2 women, Mrs. Lemke and Mrs. Astor Buick Aisher, and her 3 children whom he had killed. They floated a few feet in front of him, their faces expressionless. Their eyes were devoid of emotions, as if waiting for him on the other side, in that limbo before going up or down. He had strangled them and buried them in his backyard. He had lured them to their death through the Lonely Hearts advertisement by claiming he was looking for love, but all he wanted was their money, and he had killed them for it. He thought of his wife, Luella Strother, whom he had married in 1927, and of the basement of their home where he had killed one of the women. She had responded to his ad, and he had strangled her and killed her right there. Then he thought of where he was born, Bertha Groningen, Netherlands, and how he had moved to the U.S. when he was 17, how life was living in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and then moving to West Virginia back in 1926. He looked down at every one of the faces of those who had come to see him die, and he cared not for one of them. He would show them that he was not afraid of death. He looked over at the prison chaplain to his right, then to Warden Scroggins, who was standing to his left, then behind him at the guards who were standing stone-faced behind him. The warden asked if he had any farewell statements to make. He thought about it for a second, but he had nothing to say to any of these people. So he said no, and hated the way his voice quivered when he said it. The reality was setting in. and now he understood that in a matter of seconds he was going to leave this world. The chaplain's voice dragged him out of his reverie as his voice rang out over him and the crowd. "We commit Harry Power's soul to thee, and ask that thou pardon his sins." He watched as 3 officers moved over to the 3 buttons on the side of the wall. One of the 3 buttons would release a trapdoor. This was so that neither of the 3 officers would know who would actually release him to his death, just so they could sleep at nights. He did not feel sorry for them. They were the unlucky 3 that had picked his name out of the raffle-style bucket, and though they would be fired and lose their pensions if they refused to do this, he cared not if they did or ever slept again. Then he saw one of the guards move closer to him and put the black death cap over his head. He felt him step away and knew this was it. Immediately, his footing fell away, and there was now only blackness, for he was no longer in this world. William Holly Griffiths. William Holly Griffiths stood and stretched his aching 79-year-old body. He heard his bones cracking as he placed his hands on the small of his back and bent backwards. He had been incarcerated now at the West Virginia Penitentiary since the age of 23. That was 56 years ago. Though he was given his medication for his high blood pressure, he hated taking it. What for? So he could spend more time here in this godforsaken place, or just because he loved to piss every 15 minutes, which was one of the side effects of these pills. He walked across the yard over to the fence and turned to watch the young lads playing ball. They had even dumped a 12-year-old boy in here with the rest of these hardened criminals. He was sent here for killing his friend over a toy. But that was not William's business. He was too busy making money here in prison. He had even accumulated a nice stash too. They had got him when he tried to buy that car with a bad check. They had come to arrest him, and he had shot Constable Jeff Goff back in 1915. He had died a week later. Then, when Gasaway Police Chief G. Ord Thompson came to arrest him, William had shot and killed him too. But though he had also shot that young co-operator of the local boarding house, the one whom the constable had deputized, he didn't die, he lived. Then, in his attempt to escape at the coal railroad, while on the train heading for Glendenning, 2 police officers had spotted him. He fired at them, killing one of the officers. Then he took off and escaped. That was when the state put up a $1,000 reward for his capture. That was a lot of money back then. They had dogs and a massive posse chasing him for 6 weeks before 2 officers caught up with him in Youngstown, Ohio. That snitch of a waitress had given him up. This was at the time one of the biggest manhunts in the state's history. The court convicted him on July 16, 1915, for the murder of the officers and then sentenced him to life in prison. Life was hard, but back then he thought of himself as invincible, so he and 5 inmates planned and executed an escape in 1921. They did catch him, but not before he had killed 2 more men. After being dragged back to Moundsville, he accepted his fate and became one of the most disciplined prisoners, spending his time accumulating wealth. He behaved with the promise of getting a dog, which he did. He reminisced how much he had loved that dog. Over the years, people have tried to spring him from jail, telling the authorities that he was innocent and was being framed, but their efforts were mute. Now, on this hot day of July 10th, 1971, as a warm breeze washed over the yard, he felt tired, both mentally and physically. His dog was dead, and he just didn't have it in him anymore. Suddenly, he felt a sharp tingling in his fingers and toes. Then everything on his left side went numb. He fell to the sharp graveled ground. His brain felt as if it was growing inside his head like a balloon, threatening to burst through his skull. He knew he was having a stroke. Then blackness. William Holly Griffiths was dead. The 1986 riot. John looked up sharply from the book he was reading as the shouts got louder and angrier. He looked around and saw prisoners running from every direction heading down the hall on the first floor. He looked up at the massive clock on the wall. It was 5:30 p.m., the day after New Year's Day, January the 2nd. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted at an inmate running past him. "We got some hostages. We's tired of all this treatment, man. Today we's getting what we want," he said while running backwards, then turning to sprint down the hallway. John tossed his book on the table in the day room and followed. The whole prison was in an uproar, jostling each other, walking around angrily, threatening and cursing. John found an empty space on the bars and climbed up, looking over the heads of the crowd, trying to see the poor folks whom the prisoners had taken as hostage. From what he could see of the 14 hostages, there were 13 guards and one poor outside food service worker. He watched as they dragged them back to their feet after being slammed to the ground. He saw the scared, stiff faces of the 14 hostages being circled by the more than 200 of the 750 prisoners inside the West Virginia pen. But as time passed, they released one of the guards because his heart was giving out and they didn't want to be the cause of his death. This was not what this was about, even though one inmate was already dead. Life in prison had gotten inhumane. There was open sewage, overcrowding by more than 100 inmates, poor health care, and hardly any hot food. Temperatures would run up to 115 and would sometimes drop to below freezing. The workers were overworked with 13 inmates to one guard. It was only a matter of time before this happened again, like the riot of 1973 and 1979, when 15 inmates had escaped. One prisoner died in that escape. They had run into a 23-year off-duty state trooper and his wife, then had fatally shot him and stole his car. They had known today was going to be the day because most of the guards were on holiday leave, leaving only a skeleton crew to monitor them. John stayed out of it. Though he too was tired of the mistreatment, he only had a couple more years left before his release, so he kept his head down, staying out of trouble until the day when he would get out of this hell hole. In the end, 7 prisoners were killed, 6 in the riot, and a few days later, 33-year-old Danny Lehman, one of the most powerful inmate leaders, died 2 days later, when he and 2 other inmates were attacked by 5 inmates. He was the head of the prison branch of the Avengers motorcycle gang. Some say his death was a vie for power. Of the other 2 that were attacked, 1 died. 3 of the others that died that day were Ken Sly, a convicted child molester and killer. He was stabbed 18 times in the back and chest. Richard Dean had been tortured for 2 hours. He was stabbed and strangled, then burnt with cigarettes. The third guy, Jeff Atkinson, who was convicted of killing a pregnant woman, suffered slashes to the neck and throat. Then they killed him with a makeshift shiv. The riot lasted for 56 hours, and out of the many demands that were put forward, the only one that was fulfilled was for a larger cafeteria. A letter from Manson. The young prison guard ran into Warden Donald Boardenkircher's office, waving a letter. "Boss, you'll never guess who this is from," he said, almost out of breath, more from excitement than from exertion. "What are you on about, Garrett?" the warden said, plopping down his pen and leaning back in his oversized chair. It's a letter from Manson over in San Quentin, California. Cut it out and give it here. Who is it really from? He said, faking annoyance. Garrett handed him the letter and sat on the chair facing him, a childlike expression on his face. The warden looked at the letter, then up at Garrett. Well, I'll be, he said, looking at Garrett. Then he looked at the letter again, not sure if he wanted to know what it said. Well, aren't you going to open it, boss? Garrett asked, curiosity and anticipation making him sweat. With a furrowed brow, Warden Borden Couture reached over and picked up his letter opener. Using it, he ripped open the envelope and pulled out the piece of paper. It showed lines of almost illegible handwriting. Unfolding it, he stopped to read its contents. His face grew more serious by the second. What did it say? Garrett asked after a few seconds, unable to hold in his impatience any longer. He wants to come here, the warden said. His voice was flat, almost as if he was in shock. What? Garrett almost shouted, getting up from his chair and walking towards the door, then abruptly turning to walk back. Let me see that, boss, he said, reaching out his hand for the letter. Garrett pulled the letter to his face and read aloud. I was raised in McMitchin and Wheeling. Then he paused. You may know some of my kinfolks. California prison people had me in the hole for 14 years. I'm a good worker, and I give you my word, I'll start no trouble. Wow, Garrett said, then paused as he continued reading in silence. He finished and placed the letter back onto the warden's desk. He's saying he grew up in Brentwood, McMitchin area, and some of his relatives did time here and helped to build the roads. He wants to carry on the family tradition. His mama and uncle is who he's hammering about, right? Garrett asked, then laughed. So, what are you going to do, boss? You taking him? It will be a cold day in hell. Before you know it, you've got a wild man on your hands. We have our own problems without taking anybody else's. Now take this letter. It is so ridiculous it deserves a place on the wall. Okay, boss, Garrett said, laughing softly. With that, Garrett picked up the letter and walked out of the warden's office. He later framed the letter and hung it on the wall in the visitors' area. The Greenhouse Escapees. Hi, call me Bobby, though that's not my real name. But you don't need that for me telling this story. I can mark here that I was one of the few who got a chance to escape from the West Virginia Penitentiary right here in Moundsville. It rightly is a funny story. Me and them two was in charge of the rose garden over yonder there by the warden's house and admin building. We spent some time making it all pretty and such, growing them fancy roses and flowers, giving them to the officers for their wives. We even gave away a few to the neighborhood as a thank you for allowing us to be here. Ha! Some piece of garbage that was. Thank you for being in this hellhole. No sir, ma'am. Anyway, me and Rick, not his real name, came up with the idea. Me and the greenhouse is so close to the wall and such that we was going to dig a hole and make a break for it. But Officer Stephen, not his real name, would not take his goddamn eyes off of us. So one day I got one of my special flowers and decorated it all nice and pretty and took it over to the warden. He lived up there in the tallest part of the prison with his family. I could see it pleased him, especially because it was his wife's favorite flowers. Anyway, now I had it good with the warden. I went over to him one day looking all concerned and troubled like. I told him I could do better work in the garden and all around the prison, and I could give him better flowers to make it nice with him and the missus, if only he could tell that Stephen fella to just back off. He had been breathing down our necks and all. So the warden took him off of us, and we went digging. All my skills as a former coal miner came out to play, and in no time We had an 8 feet tall hole running under the prison wall. I had lights and exhaust fan, all nice and set. No one suspected a thing. We was dumping the dirt inside the flowers pot and using it to plant flowers around the yard. They didn't have a clue what we was doing. We were doing fine that day, acting normal like. I could have gotten an Oscar for my acting ability. Me and Rick was the first into the hole. Jeff, not his real name, was to hang back and make sure no one was coming. While we got everything open and set, he was to join us in 5 minutes. All was going according to plan. We had just popped open the hatch when we saw this kid riding past on his bike. He saw us and hightailed it. Thinking we scared him off and we were safe, we continued to make our way out of the hole. We didn't make it far though. That kid had snitched on us to his parents, and in no time we had the coppers on our ass. They caught us and flung us right back here. Darn that kid. The hanging of Frank Heyer. I'm not a good man. No, sir. I could not stand here and look you in the eye and tell you otherwise. I've seen some horrible things. Heck, I've done some horrible things. But one thing I saw that to this day will never leave me as long as I live. It was the day I witnessed the hanging of Frank Heyer on the evening of June 19th, 1931. I was one of the few inmates they let out that day to perform some light work around the yard. I was on good behavior for years. No sense in messing around and getting spanked or thrown in isolation. Life was hard enough here in West Virginia Pen without adding to it. I was not going to make it any harder for myself. I was polite to the officers and helped them out as much as they needed me to, and for that I was trusted and given privileges. Those guys were overworked anyhow and needed as much help as they could get. Getting spanked was no joke. Getting stretched out and beaten with that cat-o'-nine bullwhip boy would tear you up. I've heard tell of 8 men being beaten to death right here in this pen. Anyway, back to the story. I watched as they ushered Frank Heyer into the death cell. Then they brought in the Reverend E.G. Helm, who he had been praying with. Frank had found the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and was repentant for killing his wife the year before. He was always an abusive man, and then on December 19th, 1930, after some heavy drinking, he beat his wife to a pulp, killing her there in the restaurant and dumping her body in a tub. He then barricaded himself inside and fired a shot at the police. Didn't kill anyone, though. Said he wasn't aiming for anyone. He even claimed afterwards that he don't remember anything about that day. But nobody believed him. Now here he is, about to be hanged. He told everyone who would listen that it was a whiskey that made him do it that day. He regretted killing his wife and was not afraid to die. He said he deserved it for what he did. But what followed, man, I don't know if he even deserved that. For some strange reason that day he was happy, as if he welcomed death. He was talking up a storm with the Reverend, thanking him for turning him into a God-fearing Christian and confessing to the murder again, telling everyone that the whiskey did it. He said he wanted to commit suicide at one time and kept telling the Reverend that when he preached, he should tell the young'uns to leave the whiskey alone. I wasn't sure how to feel that day. I felt sorry for the poor soul, but he seemed happy. Then it was time. The warden placed his hand on Frank's back and guided him forward towards the gallows. They made him stand on the trap door and then placed a noose around his neck. The Reverend prayed again. Then the warden asked if he had anything to say, and he answered yes. Standing tall, he took a deep breath and spoke so everyone could hear him. "I'm guilty, and whiskey was the cause of it. I am perfectly willing to shed my blood for this crime. Jesus has saved my soul, and I am not afraid to die." Then all hell broke loose. The rope apparently was too long, and when the trapdoor opened, Frank fell through with such velocity that it popped his head right off his body, sending it in the direction of those who had paid to come to see the hanging. Everyone screamed, including me. This was the most gruesome thing I had ever seen. There was a scramble to get the head and body back together, removing the gruesome sight from the crowd, but something like that can't be unseen, boy. I was called in to help clean up the mess, and it changed my life forever. Never have I seen so much blood, and never will I be the same again. They stopped hanging the inmates out in public, then made it a private occasion, invites only. But after incidents on top of incidents, they had to stop, like when they had the 3-for-1 special hanging. I heard at one of these 3-for-1s, one of the inmates, being so small and all, fell through the hatch and hurt himself pretty badly. That didn't save him, though. He was just placed on a stretcher and was hung from the gallows, stretcher and all. Well, that's the story. Now let me get back to doing what I was doing. Take care and come back again, hear? The death of William H. Snyder, a.k.a. Red. William Snyder, one of the 4 leaders of the Aryan Brothers, a white supremacist prison gang, was born in 1946. While in his 20s, he had gone to jail for arson, but he did not stop there. Over time, he became a more violent and vicious man, so much so that one day after being released from the West Virginia Penitentiary, he went and killed 2 more men. Then again, when he was paroled, he went home, and because his 15-year-old sister was seeing a neighborhood boy, he was not happy. His father did not agree with him, so the next morning he went into his father's bedroom and shot him while he slept. Before his father's body was even cold, he went to the neighbor boy's house and held them hostage. Then, when the father tried to defend his family, Red killed him. He tried to run from the law, but a bullet to the leg stopped him, and he was incarcerated once again. With there being a constant struggle for power, Red was always in fear for his life, but he was smart and used his contacts to the fullest just to stay ahead of those who would harm him. It was even said that before every new officer came on board, he would know their names, addresses, even family members' names and addresses, and their social security numbers. He would walk up to the new recruit and say to them, "Don't give me any issues, and I won't give you any. And if an inmate gives you grief, just give me a pack of cigarettes, and I will kill him for you." Red would surround himself with his gang members, thinking that was the safest thing to do, but little did he know that his second in command, Elijah Sarton, aka Blue, would be the one to take him down. Blue wanted to be the leader of the Aryan Brotherhood and told one of the other members, Rusty Lassiter, to kill Red. At first, Rusty refused, but Blue told him it was Red or him. Not wanting to die, Rusty devised a plan to kill Red. He knew Red loved his drugs and would take them every day before going out into the yard. So he got some, and on Sunday, November 15th, 1992, he went up to Red and offered him the drugs, knowing this was too much to take at any one time, but knowing Red won't mind taking it. Red became overdosed and basically passed out on the floor of his prison cell. This gave Rusty the opportunity he needed. He pulled the sharpened piece of metal he carried around with him and stabbed Red 37 times in the chest, neck, and face. The last stab was to the left eye. Red died of asphyxiation sustained from the stab wounds and died choking in his own blood. Smithy Edwin Harding, the artist. Smithy Edwin Harding stepped back from the mural he was painting on the wall of the new cafeteria. They had finished it a couple of months ago, and he had voiced his need. Yeah, it was a need to put a mural on that wall. He was a very good artist, and the warden had asked to see what he was going to put there. So he dug deep and drew a painting of this truck. The warden gave the go-ahead because of how good it was. The truck represented freedom to him, driving cross country on the open road, something he would never get to ever do again. It also represented his hope of freedom from the nightmares he was having about killing his wife. He had killed her, then had chopped up her body and stuffed her into the freezer. He remembered that day. He had just come home tired and feeling guilty for what he had done, and she, too, knew what he had done. She led on him so bad that before long she was laying dead at his feet. In a brief stint of insanity, he had chopped up her body, hoping to get rid of her later, but all the evidence pointed to him, and now he was a lifer at the West Virginia Penitentiary. This cafeteria was the one thing they had gotten from the 56 hours riot they had staged on the second day of the new year of 1986. In a riot, though none of the officers were hurt, 6 inmates had died. Having completed most of the truck he was working on, the representation of his wife, trying to draw a picture of her as an angel, but he just could not get her face right. Her face haunted him at night, but come morning he could not remember any part of her face. He had no pictures of her, though he had asked for someone to bring him one. They never did. He moved again to the picture he was painting of Sandy and made a few more brush strokes. He sighed. This was the best he could do. Now at feeding time, he would get to see her face in the day as much as she haunted him at night. Wagon Gate. The Wagon Gate was the first real prison. This was where they forced the inmates to stay, packing them in like sardines until they built their actual prison. They would work these inmates on 12-hour shifts night and day with hardly any rest, cutting and building the prison wall. Now, because of how infamous this prison was, a lot of movies and series have been filmed here. Here are some clips of these. Fool's Parade, 1971. The Night of the Hunter.
Figured I was gone, huh?
Run, hide in the staircase. Run quick! Ruby, shit! What do you want?
I want them kids.
I'm giving you to the count of 3 to get out of here, then I'm coming across the kitchen shooting you.
The Family.
Okay, hey, this is not the way it's supposed to go down.
Out of the Furnace.
How much you loan you?
$1,500.
Mind Hunter.
Possible spectrum.
Are criminals born? Or are they formed?
Psychopaths are convinced that there's nothing wrong with them, so these men are virtually impossible to study. Yet you have found a way in near-perfect laboratory conditions.
Hello, ladies.
That's what makes this so exciting and potentially so far-reaching.
The Insanity of God.
Don't you ever believe that there is a free church and a suffering church. There's just the church.
Castle Rock, Season 1, Episode 1.
Young man, who are you? What's your name?
We got no records of you. How'd you get inside this prison? Who put you down that hole?
MTV's Fair, Season 1, Episode 1.
Is 120 years old, overcrowded, and has more than once been the site of an inmate rebellion.
Put a big cell down there, and they started killing
The walls were the world inside of the world.
About 8 or 10 of them break. And we had to go in there and hunt for bodies.
Still hot. There's still.
Can anybody hear me? Can you guys hear me? Get out of there, okay, bro? You tell me where I'm going. Just make it through that hall. You just book it. You just get the hell out of there as fast as you can.
Ghost Hunters, Season 3, Episode 3.
And then Jason and Grant hunt for a shadow man in one of the most violent penitentiaries in the country.
We've had a lot of deaths here over the years, a total of 998.
I want to find the shadow guy. What was that?
But will the spirits of the executed inmates lead them into a dead end?
Son of a bitch. What's a friggin' padlock?
I can't get to it.
Did you hear that?
What?
Ghost Adventurers, Season 1, Episode 3. Though I did not get footage of the following, here are some more films featuring the penitentiary. Paranormal Quest, multiple episodes. Sam and Colby. Ghost Asylum, Season 2, Episode 7. Correction Change. The RIP Files, Season 2, Episode 7. And Paranormal State, Season 4, Episode 8. Feel free to check them out. Well, that was some heavy stuff, and there are still so many stories that I could have featured here. But I don't want to make this too long, and I am so eager to start editing the Lunatic Asylum. So alas, that will be it for this video. So now that we have come to the end of this week's episode, I hope you found it interesting enough to like, share, and subscribe. And if you haven't already, please do so now. If you want to only listen to the stories of my adventures, I have a podcast of the same name. You will find the link below. Don't forget to check out my books on Amazon, Kindle, Google Play Books, Wattpad, and others. The links are on my website as well as below. And if you want to support this channel and help me get to more places to find more stories, I have a Patreon link below for that, or you can simply buy me a coffee. Remember, coming up next are the stories of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. You won't want to miss that. Well, that is all for now, folks. Remember to love yourself and others, and I will catch you on the next one. Love you. Bye.